my colleague. Here's quick show of hands. Who has heard or has used? Pretty good. Yeah. Real quick on the rubric is the data protection and backup and vendor. Our core competency there is we're taking your data on premises, in the cloud, in stack, backing it up, and one of our core features that we're really focused on ransomware recovery, and how it's built in, that's really focused on making sure that you just don't recover your data, but you recover a safe.
Can you please share it again?
That has no traces of the entry point. And so that's the really cool conversation.
Share the screen. Are you sharing yours?
Topic today. Good. Yeah. Thanks. Cool. Okay. And just for the market sake, rubric, they just came out with the Gartner Magic Quadrant. We're a leader for this on the right on vision. Really strong company. We just went public 3 months ago. So we're doing great things there. The thing that we want to talk about today is data security in general. And again, quick show of hands, who's in control of cloud security, whether it's networking, data, any other assets within public cloud environments? In this group? Okay. Perfect.
Who has a data security initiative that you guys are involved in or starting? So you were either evaluating or there's a yeah, so I think today we want to talk about not only we're going to cater the audience around cloud security, data security, but we'll share more about Rubric. Quick show of hands. Like I before I joined Rubric, I guess I wouldn't have thought of Rubric as a cybersecurity company. I'm curious, what is everyone's take on when you saw the presentation? Did you question like, hey, why is a backup vendor coming to
Could you please stand?
Oh, sorry.
Otherwise, people on the Zoom cannot hear.
It's like a perception in terms of, yeah, go for it.
I think it's a very common misconception with a lot of IT vendors that data protection backup falls under infrastructure and not in security. So, but it's becoming much more aware. We're seeing a lot of security professionals look at this area.
I love his response. I mean, that's perfect. That aligns so well to what we're going to cover today because I think the lines are merging between data security, data protection, data resiliency. Like there's multiple teams that are handling this across the data lifecycle. But I think for you to really reach that outcome of data resiliency, you have to approach it in a certain way. I think Rubric is doing that in a very unique way. And I'll talk about that today on the problem that we're seeing in terms of the DSPM market, which is what Mike and I are covering. One of the security leaders told me like everyone has like started somewhere and is trying to actively fill the gaps across the spectrum. So like Varonis, they started on Trem, or you have some of the newer cloud vendors that are trying to kind of revert back and cover on-premise infrastructure. And I think it's very nascent state. So I think we are taking an approach leveraging the core capabilities that we built our business around, which is cyber.
Now you're muted. It was good before when you moved into the mic, but now.
I'll make sure to stay here.
There we go. Perfect.
As you see by his poll, 88% view recovery as part of the cybersecurity platform strategy. So just again, talk about Rubric and again, feel free to interject questions. I want this to be as interactive as possible. You guys are here after hours, but the focus is to secure the world's data. I know this is very high level, kind of hand wavy, but I think the way we approach it really emphasizes the point of what we're trying to accomplish and kind of like the angles we're taking to meet this end objective of securing the world's data is really unique in the market. So start with the problem statement. Everyone here that's managing cloud security, like your data is growing super fast. Especially as companies adopt Snowflake and Databricks, and you have these big data initiatives, and everyone is trying to monetize the data. So it's actually growing at 63% year over year in the enterprise. Most security sales leaders say it's exceeding their ability to keep up. So you're not getting new headcount every time your data estate grows. You have to find ways to be more, to leverage more automation, to really put more controls around it. And I think that's the challenge, because security teams are so inundated with what they have on the table already, with all the alerts and just keeping up the day to day. Also, we're seeing everyone has a cloud initiative, everyone's trying to move to the cloud, but there's always going to be some on-premise environments and some critical applications that you can't move to the cloud. So you have to be able to support the cloud and on-premise, and then in addition, SaaS applications like Microsoft 365, Snowflake. So again, you have to have that holistic visibility, or you can't have a data security program. And then also, when we look at like the breaches, whether it's AT&T, Advanced Auto, Ticketmaster, I don't know if you guys saw that every social security number was hacked yesterday. So it's endless. It's always in the news, and I think the big thing here is hackers are logging in versus breaking. It's not some brute force attack. They're finding ways to compromise credentials. So people that should have access to data, they're just being leveraged to actually exfiltrate that data from legitimate sources. And then if you look at the SEC, they have a 4-day period from a material breach to report. Well, if you look at United Healthcare, which 23 plus weeks, and they still don't know what data was exposed. So it's very challenging to do all those things that I mentioned, but also without proactively having a continuous and updated inventory of your data. Not just your data, but like being able to stack rank it for what's sensitive, what's informational data. How do I put more controls around the data that has business value versus the data that doesn't have any value to business? And then top it all off, like AI every board has a data or cyber resiliency plan and an AI strategy. Those two are every single board member's asking their teams, what are their plans around that? So I think the fact that the data is moving across your environment faster than ever creates so many challenges, which is another question. I know you guys have a topic coming up, but who owns risk for AI? Is it the CISO? Is it the CIO? Is it the chief risk officer? Who do you guys typically see is taking on the CISO? Okay. And I mean, it just depends on the organization. Sometimes it is the CIO, because they're the ones that are actively trying to monetize the data. And but the CISO, they have a tough position because they're always trying to keep up with the speed of the business. And again, it's a very challenging thing because, like most companies, there's typically a lot of silos, a lot of shadow IT, and it's very challenging. So what we're going to talk about, so that, again, you guys understand some of the challenges, I'm sure. I don't know if there's anything else I left off that you guys are thinking of in terms of your data security challenges, but anything I missed?
Main question I'd throw out is, does anyone have a co-pilot story they have for M365 or Microsoft right now? Or large language models, ChatGPT, figuring out how to use your corporate data in a searchable GPT format. Folks have different initiatives there, AI, data classification. That's really what we're focused on here. And the core of it is not only understanding where your data lives throughout your environment, whether that's on-prem, cloud, or in SaaS environments, but taking it a step further to understand what that data actually is in the real context, understand, is it personally identifiable information, is it credit card information, is it, things we've seen in the field is folks are putting their AWS secret keys in publicly exposed S3 buckets. That's a very common one. generalized passwords that are stored in CSV files that downloads from their Google Chrome browser. You know, all sorts of different things that you wouldn't necessarily find just if you knew the asset that's out there. We actually have to look at the data, understand what it is, and then we can start piecing together a business plan around how do we protect that data when a breach inevitably occurs. And that's really the thought process we have right now. Is it's a win, not a conversation anymore. So we're doing our best to bring that conversation forward and say, before that attack actually happens, let's understand where all our data is, let's secure it, let's put it in the right places, so that when that attack happens, the blast radius is minimized. And that's ultimately the goal of what we're trying to do. So lost me talking about that.
Yeah,
Any questions there real quick? Okay.
So your product is our own system is ready, but let's say client system is ready. Is product, is your product also focusing on while the client is developing their own product, so how to take care of the security?
It's a bit less on the app stack, if that's really where you're touching on. This would be, think about, say cloud environments. You have your S3 buckets, your disks for all your EC2 instances, your databases, same with Azure, your blob storage,
Snowflake.
your Snowflake storage. This is more of thinking that out of all the security controls you have, the crown jewel is still your data. Like ultimately, that's what people are after. That's where the value is. So, and I've worked in the industry for a long enough time doing network security, data centers, even in the cloud space. You all heard the terms like CSPM, cloud security posture management. That's all great to lock and key the environment, but what we're seeing is so prevalent nowadays is just assume credentials. You know, your IT admin credentials get stolen. All those locks don't matter anymore. And now that admin or the hacker that looks like the admin is now accessing all your sensitive data. So that's ultimately the focus is, you know, the applications are driving the business value. What we're looking at is the data generated from that, making sure that's safe and secure. And that's in the context of before a data breach. We actually have ways to identify it during a breach, you know, looking at audit logging. And then finally, the core competency of Rubrik that's been the core product for 10 years now, which is safe recovery of that data. If it's encrypted, stolen, et cetera. So does that help?
Yeah. So it's data is being very stored.
Yeah. So that's just speaking of data protection itself. And there's various vendors that do that. I wouldn't say we're the only people doing that out there, but the idea is that when you copy data, a lot of it honestly ends up in, say, AWS S3, because what we can do is actually lock that data from being accessed. So there's a lot of times that we'll copy a user's hot storage in AWS, put it in some archival storage, also in S3, maybe in like a lower tier, but also lock it so that nobody can touch it. And that's part of the system at large. Because if it's not immutable, it kind of loses all value, right? So that's like kind of the core data protection side. We're, again, when we look at the beforehand, we're not as worried about immutable because the data is just where it is, you know, but we're scanning it, we're classifying it to make better decisions on how we want to protect it on the back end. If that helps. Yeah. Okay.
Is the data encrypted once it's backed up?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. So this.
Does it mimic the ransomware type activity?
So that's kind of the key, right? So say you back up data in 12 hours every 24 hours. And technically, yes.
You just said no one can access.
Correct.
It's in the S3 buckets.
Yeah, so that's kind of the beauty of Rubrik. And again, I don't want to speak about other vendors. I'm sure they do similar things in some sort of way, but the way we do our backups is a focus on how we incrementally back up that data. We're basically taking this every day that you back up. So say today it was you got attacked, all your files got encrypted. Technically, yes, that gets backed up, but we have all the insight to say 2 days ago, we saw 0 indicators compromised for that data. And so we can back it up or recover, like say, to a safe space. Now, there's bigger questions presented about what was the entry point? Did they actually extract their data? So there's more to that story, but you're correct. And we recover it in a smart way to make sure it doesn't happen again. But that's actually a really common thing as well is vendors that don't look at when it happened, when the actual bug or malware or something is actually inserted. It happens all the time where a company will get breached, all their stuff gets encrypted, they panic, recover, and then it gets encrypted again 3 days later because that is still in there. So that's where some of our core feature set is on the, especially on the after side of the equation. Does that help? Yeah. Any other questions?
So, and like, talk about the data inventory, having a constant up-to-date catalog of data. Part of that is like, who has access to the data as well? So, the first part of data security strategies is you have to be able to see it to secure it. So having that, a heat map across all of your data stores, where your data is, which data is sensitive. So you want to obviously put more controls around that. And then who has access to it in terms of, as Mike alluded to, how can we reduce risk and really minimize the blast impact if there was credentials that were compromised? Mike shouldn't have access to 5,000 PII records if he doesn't need to, or be a security group that has access. So it's ways to be strategic on the front end so that if there is a breach, which in this day and age, we operate under the assumption of a breach. It's a when, not if scenario. How do we, again, minimize the risk to the business and find ways to bounce back quickly to your operation?
So it's what's your method or way to distinguish the quality of data? Not all data is same, right? So
Yeah.
what's the mechanism?
100%. And I'll let you elaborate, but what's behind this is our classification engine. So we have a classification engine that can scan all of your data and not only just look at, hey, it's 7-digit social security number, but we look at context on the file to understand, is there a name, is there an address, and then now there's 7 number of digits. So you have to have trust in that categorization or else your data security project's not gonna be great, or you're gonna lose faith in the tool. So we put a lot of investment and focus on the fidelity of the classification. And, at the end, he'll show you maybe how we break it down between social security, address, medical record. Like there's 178 different data types out of the box that we can distinguish through our classification. But you're right. I think, and that actually leads into how we're complementing the core business in cyber recovery. We want to understand, you don't want to back up your PII or PHI data the same way you back up email data. So you want to be able to stack rank it and really create recovery time or SLAs based on how important that data is. So I think that's most of what we're focused on the front end. And then again, the core rubric platform is for the recovery.
Zach, do you have any question follow-up?
Yeah, but do you have a tiered approach for saving, securing that data?
Yeah, so I'd say in a nutshell, if we take it kind of step by step, and I'll try to boil it down, is on the more preventive side, the before side, I would say, we're discovering assets that are out there. A lot of those assets we may not even be aware of, so that's part of it, just to understand what else is out there from a visibility perspective. As Lost mentioned, the way the classifications work is it's more than just a regex pattern match. We're doing this deeper analysis to make sure that there's a high confidence it is what it is, because it's really easy to have, say, fake SSNs or credit cards, and we're doing like the Euchre checks and all that fun stuff. At that point, we have already predefined classifications for those, and that's our perspective being in the space of is this restricted information, which would be like your social security numbers, credit cards. Maybe it's more internal information that could be, I don't know. As a pure example, like first name, last name, maybe something that's not as relatively important. And then you might have benign information, which could be synthetic data or something else. So that's how we not only scan the data, but we give it some sort of tier out of the gate. Now that's fully adjustable if you think certain types of data are more important than others. And then that should dictate your backup and recovery policies, saying my highly restricted data should have the tightest SLA for recovery, for example. This other data, we could probably let it sit in the archive for a week, things like that. So does that help? Okay.
Well, that's a great question because it does get a little bit more nuanced than that because we have company we're working with, like a pharmaceutical company. They're like, we don't care about, zip codes and social security numbers. We care about molecules. Like, how do you identify that pattern and then use, machine learning to constantly find that data and classify it sensitive. So it gets a lot more complex for different use cases, but
This, you stuff like watermark and stuff like that, so if the company already was marking stuff, it's confidential.
Yeah, it's actually a good topic. We'll cover it later.
that is a great topic.
We interviewed or interviewed with Microsoft Purview. I guess we're showing is everybody know Purview or Purview? DNA. Basically, Purview is part of Microsoft's larger suite around data classification, data labeling, things like confidential labels. I assume that's more or less where you're going.
Yeah,
The watermark. Yeah, so, Purview, yes, we respect those labels, but to be honest, we're seeing two issues in the field right now. One is that for the most part, labels are assigned by the producer, which is generally not accurate, frankly. And so we look at the picture two ways. One is that if we scan and classify data that's sensitive and it doesn't have a label at all, we have a workflow that adds a confidential label or whatever you want it to be, just to get something on there for the sake of filtering. The other thing is that we see our highly sensitive data that's labeled as internal or public or something it should be, we can override that. Which I think, you kind of think listed that second set of eyes, which is nice. That's a really common thing right now. Speaking of, again, data that into Microsoft Copilot or LLMs is making sure the data that goes in is tagged accurately. The worst case, and then when the anecdotes we've seen out in the field is all this data is ingested into these LLMs, these AI models, but now maybe through in finance, you can see proprietary information because it wasn't labeled accurately, or folks on the front desk can see everyone's pay stubs. So
Yeah, access control gets really difficult. Gen AI comes.
yeah, absolutely.
Classified.
Yeah,
You know when they have access.
definitely.
Another problem there is like usually it's not the security team that's doing the classification because they don't really know. So the HR team is doing it and they may miss something, they may not. So it's kind of you're up to user discretion and we like to put some guardrails around that to make sure it doesn't get pulled into Copilot, someone's W-2 or pay information that's like pulled in. So but yeah,
Just to define, if folks don't know, Microsoft Copilot is like their own large language model, AI model for OneDrive, SharePoint, just in case anyone's curious.
You could also ask, hey, you'll find me anything that looks like a password. You'll find me anything that's passwords.txt.
that's true.
So passwords.csv.
Yeah,
And I have access to them.
it's kind of a lot of such.
So if you don't have access, you're not considered. So it does actually pull your data into one private. This is Microsoft for app, which is inside the camera. And then it gets pulled out from Microsoft service.
Yeah.
But what they do is inspect. Somebody can't look at my emails. But if I can, doing something, talking all the emails I got last week, I can pay attention to, which is kind of convenient. But then your data is also leaving your pending data to Microsoft there that your shared service. So that's the rest.
Absolutely. We're seeing a trend going with that is, including ourselves, that we're going to run our internal, not Microsoft branded LLM, but it's twofold, but right, we're going through the same growth pains of making sure our own internal documents are tagged accurately, to make sure certain folks can or cannot see certain things. So Again, I'll just say it's kind of a wild west right now. There's, the security risk is very high, but it's a very sought after feature. So we're trying to at least bring some ways to bring a little bit of that conversation. But yeah, that's very active. They have, for sure. Yeah. Any other questions? I know we're still on slide.
Yeah, so I want to take the approach and look at you know, where we're solving this problem. Let's start with in the peacetime. This is most security practitioners are focused on this. How do we reduce risk? How do we prevent you know, business impact? How do we capture vulnerabilities? How do you know, preventative stuff to ensure that bad guys can't get in your system or exfiltrate data. But as you look at, you know, in the event of a breach or the wartime, when, you know, when you're actually breached or you're ransomware and you're shut out of your own systems, I'm curious, like, where does your team or security practitioners draw the line between, okay, now IT operations takes over for the recovery? Like, is there coordinated efforts, or where do you think that line is drawn? Because the feedback I'm getting from CISOs is they're like, I want to control that because I'm taking on that risk. So I think I'm seeing this, the CISO role shift a little bit more to the right. I'm curious what everyone else's feedback is on kind of where that line stops between security and then the team, the SecOps or whoever is actually doing the recovery.
Yeah, you involve all of it. Otherwise, like I said, you end up 3 days later doing again.
So I guess, has anyone in this room been a victim of a ransomware attack, crypto attack, anything like that? And did you feel like the situation was within control, or was it a little just crazy? Like, I'm just curious, you know, honestly, we have primitive to what really having to process. We were able to recover data for being backed up. Okay. But it was a combined effort. It wasn't, trust the desktop team. So between security, the server team, the desktop team, they'll work together to make that resolve. Okay. It's in 9 plays. We have very high, midnight enforcing like stuff like that. So got it. Okay, that's great. Yeah.
I think the big thing is having. You're gonna need the whole team. Just if you don't have a plan, you're gonna have to. And that's more. I think the CISO needs to lead because it is part of a cyber event you're trying to recover. You need that coordination at the top of when you're gonna sequence data and how you're gonna do it, or when you're gonna do it.
Yeah, you're right. The tabletop process is we actually do in Mark coordinated one before, but it's pretty good exercise to go through for any company. So talking about like the challenges we're DSPing, I'll start kind of on that piece on the preventative side.
Sorry, real quick. Just the acronym. I know that DSPM is a common term. Data security posture management is kind of a newer segment that's been created, and that's where we're.
Yeah, that's a good distinction. Yeah, data security posture management. I think I liken it to, everyone has a vulnerability program at their company. Like, how do we again patch 0-day vulnerabilities or vulnerabilities across their infrastructure? I don't think it's any different with data. If you have vulnerable data that is publicly exposed or again overly accessed by someone that shouldn't, overly permissive access, you need to constantly go in and take risk off the table and find ways to shrink your footprint. So that's what we're helping companies do. I think it starts with, where's all my data? Most security teams I talk with, when I ask where's your sensitive data, they say they know where it all is and they have no issues. And then we do a scan. We always find, customer records in a developer environment. Or the other day we actually did a POC with a company and they had an S3 bucket labeled private, and they had all these customer invoices in there with social security numbers and addresses. It was publicly exposed. So like they were able to go into our tool and access it. So I mean, that's thousands of records. So it just, you never have the certainty until you actually run a scan and show kind of where your exposure is. And that's kind of what we're helping do. We're helping surface that, kind of shine the light on where there is vulnerable data, misplaced data. So if you have GDPR, if you have EU data in like an S3 bucket in the US, obviously you're subject to GDPR fines. And also like through that exercise, we're finding all this stale and redundant data. Another company we worked with, they told us they had 500 terabytes in the cloud. They had 3 petabytes, and 2 of it was just redundant data that they didn't even need. So not only are you spending way more you need to in cloud costs, but like you're tripling your attack surface. So where can we help identify that stale and redundant data so you can purge that or archive it or do whatever you want to do? But I feel like businesses these days just hoard a lot of data because they don't want to get rid of it. But again, it widens your attack surface. And then, who has access to data? I think this is another area that we're really focusing on when we talk about S3. There's 44% of the world's data is located in S3. How do we show you, kind of prioritize your risk based on the amount of data and who has access to it? And so, again, as security professionals, we want to make sure we don't send you everywhere. We want to help you prioritize which ones are the most important, where's the most risk across your environment, and allow you to start there to kind of work your way down. And then last thing, in terms of like data exfiltration, like that's a lot of people think that is external. That can be internal as well. You can have a disgruntled employee that goes and they want to, download a bunch of IP. And we can find ways to detect that in real time to really prevent that and allow you to act quickly. So what we're doing on this kind of preventative front is, again, first thing first, you got to understand where your data is. And then you have to be able to stack rank it based on the classification. Everyone's focused on trying to implement least privilege. So I think understanding, again, that the access permissions across your sensitive data is really critical to understanding your risk. And then, where we have synergies with data protection levels, if you have SLAs for certain types of data and you need to back it up, I think this is where this cyber resilience come in. You can actually tier it based on the business impact or business criticality of the data. So, these are everything we're helping you do on the front end, again, to reduce your risk, to reduce the impact of the business if something does happen or if there is a breach. Any questions on that, just in terms of like what else we're surfacing up to?
Does this resonate with folks? Have y'all gone down this road of shining a light on the data that you have in your environments? Is this what y'all have been working on? I'm just curious if anyone wants to talk about it.
The last one.
Oh, yeah.
You check data.
Same question.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll drive the demo in a few minutes and we'll get into it. But
Yo, there's a quick overview. I know we got limited time, but
or is that more of a high level question or more detailed? I can answer you what. And you're asking specifically how do we? Hey, Mike, can you repeat the question so people over here?
yeah. So for the people on the bridge, how do you detect this one at the far right? How do you detect a data breach as it occurs? And we'll talk about that. We'll pull up the demo just real briefly. We're not going to do an hour demo, but just kind of maybe we'll focus on that.
I can answer it real quick, and then we can show you. The trend in malware and breach and whatnot. You would hope that the adversary takes all your data in one big scoop. It sounds like everything is super obvious. You're people. Sometimes that happens. Maybe what realistically happens is, especially for attackers that are a bit more dedicated, they do what we call a spear phishing campaign, like very directed at somebody that entry point into the environment, steal their credentials and then access data. They're not exactly sure out of the gate what they can access. So what they do is kind of nibble at different folders and if they consume roles in different environments. So it's small things at a time. And then at some point, there is a ramp up, they found access they need, and they tried it enough that it hasn't triggered their access being turned off. And that's when the bigger faults happen. So, and we'll show it is, obviously, between all the cloud providers, all the solutions, facility logs is generated in the day. Question is what's noise, what's not. The way, and again, I like the way we do this, and again, I've been working in this, the cloud security space for a while. The thing that really matters is that sensitive data. If there is somebody nibbling at something smaller, you want to call it out, but it may or may not require immediate action. But if a user that we've been, if we're looking at audit logging, basically, in the cloud, every API call, et cetera, and there's a user who has only been accessing an EC2 instance as of the admin, all of a sudden is looking at your assignments, S3 bucket, or unlimited sensitive file. We give you an alert that basically says something odd going on.
We're logging in for a new IP and it like, so it's.
Or yeah, across the world or something like that. And this is when that point is, we build that story through a few sets of like condensed logs. We can have one main alert that user has been looking at sensitive files, now you can download 1,000 files. And the benefits here, we can say, we've seen exactly what files are downloaded. We know what information is in those files. We also know the user's access permission. So we also know what we consider the blast radius of that reach. And that draws attention to, okay, something's happening. But I'll put that visually in
Yeah, great question. Then.
Yeah, so the common thing, and again, it depends on how well you build this from the start, if you're using a guard tower or control tower, and there's ways you can lock that down. And even our own tool, because we're, that's a separate conversation. I'll start with your question. Yes, so like typically, say it's a third-party contractor or someone else, you're going to build a role for their access. So they can only do the exact things they're supposed to do in that cloud environment through permission statements. But more realistically is your IT admin account gets hacked. They usually may have access to the dev account, to your bot account, to your testing account. And within AWS, it could be as easy as just clicking a Dropbox and getting into that environment. So that's where it gets challenging because at least AWS's perspective, that's legit traffic. Where we have to start investigating that is what's that user been doing the last 6 months, and then all of a sudden he's doing something completely different, especially different IPs, different time zones, different files that you don't access. So in short, yes, that's an extremely typical way is jumping through IAM and access credentials to basically laterally move between the environment. So, or is that like what you've seen, or
When I don't think it's still.
it really depends on how the permission is built. That where we privilege permission is such a big trend today is you really only want to let a user do explicitly what they should be doing and nothing else. The reality is it's not that common. Like we want it to be that common in most organizations, but it's really not. Folks take shortcuts, or more realistically, there's developers that have access to the cloud that they have IAM creation policies. They're not security engineers, so they threw some gaps in there. And so that's where the issues start popping up. So within that conversation, there's a bigger context around your whole security program at your environment, how locked down you have it. And that's part of the story here. Cloud security is a really complex topic with a lot of different pieces. This is one piece of it, identity is one piece of it, network security is one piece of it. Combining those all together is the tricky part. And it's much harder than on-prem because the attack surface is massive. You don't have like the one firewall anymore. You've got Lambda policy or Lambda triggers that are opening up APIs. You've got traditional EC2, you have hosted services, SaaS services, and to have a common security framework around all that is like extremely hard. So, but again, that's what we're seeing out there is IAM is, I think 80 to 85% of current breaches come from identity in some way. Stolen credentials, copying credentials, things like that. So,
Great question. I'm gonna close this out real quick. So I think the reason why Rubric started, we built this business around cyber recovery is because that piece is the most important. Like on average, enterprise companies have 47 plus enterprise security tools. And if you look at the breaches, like people are still getting it. So it's not like they have a shortage of tools. It's like, how do you bounce back quickly in the event of attack? And I think, as I'll talk about this, security is starting to become more involved in the recovery. And I think that the fact that we talked to a CISO the other day, and he was like, CISO of a large healthcare organization. And he's like, hey, I'm okay with breaches. Like, I don't want to get breached. I don't, I'm not expecting it. But if I lose service, if I'm out of my applications, like people die. We can't run ambulances. We can't fill prescriptions. So like you're absolutely going to lose money if you're out of service for more than 24 hours. And the reputational, the hit you take from a brand reputation, your investors, it's crippling. So I think the first thing that you want to know when a breach does occur is what data was compromised. I think that goes back to what we're doing in the front end with ESPN, giving you that information. Like, was it the S3 bucket with cat gifts, or was it the S3 bucket with social security numbers? Like, that's a big distinction. It's the difference when you have an email every single one of your customers telling you that there was a breach versus a targeted 20 people that, hey, you got breached and we'll have to refund you, send you a $10 Uber Eats or something.
Yeah, it was a bit like CrowdStrike, by the way. Everybody I was on an international flight the day it got breached, and I don't know how I made that flight, to be honest. There's about 1,000 people in the airport waiting to get through data. It was an absolute nightmare. But yeah.
Yeah, so I think that's the biggest piece we help with is again, not people are going to get breached, and the difference between a breach of sensitive data and non-sensitive data is really significant. But I think the restore is a thing that no one wants to go through. Obviously, we had one person go through a ransomware event. It's becoming more and more prevalent. Like, how do you want to be the CIO that can't recover and you're on the clock. So where we're helping, and then I'll tie this back together with the preventative side, but understanding the scope of the attack, like quickly. So we have an immutable copy of your data, and we can derive the time series of events to determine like who was impacted, where it was impacted, so you guys can quickly restore within 24 hours. After 24 hours, again, every customer knows, your investors know, there's no way you're going to be able to hide that. And Rubric, we can put a $10 million cyber warranty on our ability to recover customers within 24 hours. We've had 200 incidents today. 100% of those were fully recovered. So this is what we focus on. But I think, again, with where we've expanded our capabilities to security to minimize the impact in the front end with the data classification has even enhanced our ability to do this even more effectively. Just to recap it, again, I talked earlier about like the board, your leadership, they care about cyber resilience. They don't really care about what tools you have, what people, what your responsibility is to the company. Like the end goal is they want the data to be protected and recovered as quickly as possible if something does happen. And I think when you look at combining those two, there's not any other vendor on the market that does both these in one platform like Rubric. And I think we're going to continue to invest in really streamlining the efforts of both these teams between security and IT operations, kind of CISO responsibilities and CIO, to focus on that end outcome of cyber resilience. And we've got several companies we're doing this for today, and I think we're only going to see that kind of convergence in the future. You have a question?
With data protection changing pretty rapidly with different things happening, different data points coming in, different security, concerns around. Is there set standards that people are referring to specifically for backup recovery, data protection? Or is that kind of be rolled up into like a CIS, a NIST? Is there something that's very specific that leaders can follow to follow best practices for data protection?
It's a great question.
Yeah, I mean, I'll chime in out of the gate and then feel free to add. Ideally, we want to look at a cloud security strategy from a very high level and break it down. Typically, that's going to start with a framework, a CIS, a NIST, CSA controls, things like that. That's going to give you guidance. And then it really comes down to the business. So something like all data should be encrypted, kind of a no-brainer. Data should be able to be recovered during a breach, okay? But each individual group has to decide what information is that critical or what application is that critical. Excuse me. So it's a bit custom, but the general rules, excuse me, the general rules are going to be found in those framework documents, and they do a very good job. And those are being uploaded for the cloud, for example. Now we obviously have best practices ourselves that we've learned from customers from other things over, the 12 years we've been doing, even specifically the recovery aspect. So that's like a well-oiled machine in that sense. And that's where things like design on the front end of understanding your specific environment, what you have, what you want to do with it, is part of that planning process. And then as Lawson said, we're extremely confident in the abilities that we can help you recover in an event or something else. We put a $10 million warranty price tag on it that we're that confident, and that's a conversation. So a bit yes, a bit no.
Do you guys provide consultancy services as well to help organize? Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, at the end of the day, we're a security software hardware vendor.
Yep.
We're full service in that sense. So we're doing, we're manufacturing the recovery appliances. We're doing the consultancy services.
We actually
We're doing-
started like Mandiant from like a cyber recovery partner perspective.
But yeah, like, before deployment, after deployment, full spectrum planning, give you an artifact that says, based on our conversations, here's all your RPO, RTO settings for these data sets. Yeah, that's all part of like our process as a company.
And then we also have a ransomware response team. So in the event of a breach, they're immediately engaged as part of the us, and they will throughout that process expand it or another group that you part of the station, and they don't disengage until you're back up. So it's kind of a full turnkey from architecting, consulting, through to in the event of a breach, we make sure we take care of it as well.
I'm not sure if it is the right question for this one, but does it cover like insurance, cyber attack insurance?
Not necessarily. So we see, it's kind of an interesting question. I mean,
That is an interesting question, and I'll let you answer, and I'll provide.
yeah, so I'll say I'm kind of more on the technical side of this conversation, and I don't want to discount cybersecurity insurance at all. It's an important thing. Anecdotally, I've seen many times that if a breach occurs and a ransom note comes and says, hey, pay us 70 grand, you might pay the insurance company 150 grand for that service. They're going to pay the 70 grand to get the key and then pocket the difference, right? So I don't want to discount anything. That's just, you got to make sure it's structured the right way. Now, we wouldn't, if anything, we would supplement that service, because at the end, like, we're not in the business of like negotiating with the ransomware actors. We're more focused on like, how do we get you back up and running as quickly as possible? And, we'll be a part of the discussion depending on, because there's, I don't know, 1,000 ransomware strains out there today, and they're all pretty hard to crack anymore. They've gotten better and better as years went on. So if anything, like some of our biggest customers probably have a like a ransomware insurance policy. And then if you have us as a data backup and recovery solution, as Mark mentioned, part of the agreement is that we're helping you in the trenches getting out of that situation in any way possible. So I don't know if you want to add to that or lost.
I would just add from a thought leadership perspective that we work closely with cyber insurers to ensure that the policies, the way that they're putting those forward to the organizations that use them are requiring certain things to be able to be insurable. So we work with companies like certainly other companies with cyber insurance as well. But those companies look to us to say, what are the things that an organization needs to have in place for us to be willing to insure? And then we obviously work with them as part of the recommendation process and kind of the end-to-end.
Yeah, so I was like referring to the, usually companies have master service agreements. And as part of the agreements, certain risk, each company might have certain risk appetites, like what can be covered, what is not covered.
Sure.
So I'm sure like if you are providing a cyber security cover in a way that you know, will prevent or whatever. So we have kind of percentage like, you know, we will cover up to this percent, and if something goes wrong, then it's company's responsibility or data owner's responsibility.
Yeah, so that, as a quick response and you can add some color, when we talk about, and as far as I know, the only company that does this is actually brings in like a ransomware guarantee, and it's not just a sales thing. As Mark mentioned, we have this, it's a 24/7 team that's helping companies recover. There is a high-end limit, and that's based on like how much data you're protecting. There is some rules to make sure like you're doing things, mentioning best practice, like making sure that you're doing what we recommended and not being just egregious with opening everything up to the public, for example. So there's terms and conditions with that, but I will say, as Lawson mentioned, again, like 200 and counting large enterprise corporations that we've helped recover, using the tech of ours that, again, helps you bring back data before the malware was inserted and making sure you have clean data. Is that, I want to make sure.
Yeah,
right.
So I was involved in multiple master service agreements for SaaS products,
Sure.
and it took a year to get that signed. So
It's not a quick process. Yeah,
So when
absolutely.
I'm thinking about the cybersecurity product, it's much more diligence is required, like in terms of understanding like what is covered, what is not covered,
Sure.
and then because I think the major problem in most of the companies, in my experience, is the people actually who own the data need to have a good understanding of what is actually PII.
Absolutely.
That is where the problem starts, because most people don't understand and handle the data the way it should be. Like
Sure.
client name is a very confusing term, could be ambiguous in certain cases. Where should I call this as a, just give you an example. So Fidelity is one company, everybody knows about it. If I'm putting the data, everybody knows that a particular bank, almost every bank is holding Fidelity's data. So can I call it as a client or not? It's very ambiguous question.
Right.
And that is where the problem starts. So I think the main problem is like making sure the data owner understands like what is the data they're holding, whether it's a PII, client data, whatever it is, and then it's like how to secure it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a perfect segue, and I'll say, before I joined Rubrik, I was at a large partner primarily focused on cloud security, and at the time it was CSPM, CNAP, the things that have been around for a few years now. And every day in the back of my head, I was like, is this actually valuable to the business? If we lock the borders around the castle, so to speak, it's a security value, but is it a business value? Where I think that extra layer of understanding the data itself and not just the controls around that data is kind of the key to everything is, and to your point, it allows you to make real decisions based on your core asset that isn't just guess and check, because you may or may not think a secure environment actually has secure data. It could be nothing, same as an unsecure environment with a lot of sensitive data. And I think that's where this is driving real value, is highlighting what's out there and then building a real, cyber resiliency is a term that's grown over the last few years, but I truly think we have a great end-to-end vision of identifying the data. If something's happening in real time, we'll be able to catch it and then when it happened, we have a plan for you to bring it back to start. But it all comes down to that data context, which, for a long time, the CSPMs and things just did not have. And I was always scratching my head about that one. Obviously, there's been like, if y'all follow the industry, there's about 10 acquisitions that happened in the last 2 years, in that space, because it's so important right now.
So, does your product helps to classify?
Yes.
How does it do that, like?
Yeah, I'll load in the demo in a minute. The quick and dirty of it is it's a 2-step process for onboard. We discover what's out there from like a pure asset perspective, S3 buckets, storage drive, et cetera. And then we use just read-only API calls to read the contents of your S3 information. The important thing I'll note is that none of that data leaves your environment. We create some Lambda functions and stuff that are extremely locked down, and they're basically looking at data right next to it. We don't have to pull it to our SaaS tenant or anything else. So we try to keep it as secure and tight as possible. But that, say, Lambda function or those EC2 processing is where we look at the data, look at the context of the data. So regex scans as well as information around the data to give it a bit more confidence. And from there, we can be highly confident that this data is, PII information, financial information, et cetera.
Yeah,
So
I mean, I
kind
think
of our
that's the
main
biggest
stuff, yeah.
part of a data security posture management tool, is if you can't classify the data well, like everything else fails after that. So I think that's the biggest area of focus for us, and making sure that customers have confidence in that classification when they look into the platform.
Good question.
Oh, it's a great question.
Yeah, I'll say we're extremely fast. It's hard for us to benchmark, just again, anecdotally. And I don't
I'll just give you an example. We did an international hotel chain. We discovered and classified 15 billion records in 24 hours. So the time to value is very quick, and that's the one thing I love about it as well. Just you're not spending months trying to get a hold of your data, and so I think that's a big piece of it, where customers in the first week can determine, hey, where are risks? Do we need to invest in this? How do we prioritize this? And kind of work towards that.
Yeah, I'd say as a comparison, some of the competitors, especially the ones that maybe started on-prem and are building cloud competitors, I would say ours is rooted in cloud data, and then we can link back to our on-prem appliances, so we have a good combination there. The on-prem vendors that are trying to do cloud, it might be a multi-site thing for the same discovery. So, this from our proprietary type process, it's extremely rapid, and we've got a lot of customers with case studies we can show just like losses that billions of records in days.
Any other question? Yeah. Yeah, you're fine.
So, since you are taking backups and data is increasing massively, so as a client, like, how do they weigh like the cost of storing the extra data for recording purpose versus the security? So is there like some, having, I would say, a pointers, like, how do I decide?
Yeah, so the interesting thing around that conversation is part of our value pitch is around total cost of ownership. A good example is that AWS backup as a service today only backs up to hot storage. We have the extra intelligence to take certain sets of data and put it in Glacier or infrequent access, something, and we found 30% data savings on our backups compared to native tooling. So we've found specific ways, especially in cloud environments, AWS, Azure, GCP, that we can do it better than the cloud provider themselves. And for what it's worth, the cloud providers like that because they have 500 products within Microsoft Azure, for example. This may or may not be their core priority. So folks, groups like Rubrik can come in and provide a better story there and a better solution. And the best part is that Azure still gets all that consumption, right? So if we're backing up your Azure blob storage and whatnot to Azure Vault or something that we help control and migrate, Azure still gets consumption out of it, just speaking in terms of why they're okay for us to jump in that conversation.
Yeah, I think to take it a step further, as mentioned, like they just have one premium tier of backup. So we can actually tier it out where you back up your sensitive data, your business critical data in a different tier than just informational data. You save money and you're more strategic in how you're doing your recovery.
So data retention rules too.
Data retention, yeah, I mean, that's a huge piece of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, so each set of data that you back up, you give it a specific data retention policy, recovery point, recovery time objectives. And that's basically our back end, so that when something does happen, we understand exactly when and how that data needs to get backed up or recovered, I should say. So that's all part of the design policies for the backup side of the equation. Yeah, so that's all built into it. I had something else to add to that.
And do you provide some kind of like reports to show like how many attacks were prevented or non-alerted, some kind of statistics?
In terms of a per client basis, we at least highlight when things look out of ordinary. Now, in terms of globally rubric, like us across all customers, it's probably something we could pull up. I doubt we'd be able to pull that up today, but that's something we could publish, no problem. Because again, we're looking at that from an aggregate. We probably have, I'm not sure how many customers we have today, 5,000-10,000.
We have 7,000.
Over 1,600 customers.
Yeah, so 6,000 customers existing. And there's a lot of, again, like not your customer data, but a general data around the environment, because that's a lot of data being protected, a lot of data being backed up. So yeah, the one thing I did want to say too, though, about the cost conversation is that the core backup system also does like deduplication and other things that shrink the data set anyway. So we get lower costs from that, as well as we can tier it more effectively than the cloud providers themselves. And then you add in a lot of the features around, ransomware recovery and all that. And it becomes, frankly, I mean, one of our biggest advantages right now is purely total cost of ownership as a way to justify using rubric backup, to be quite honest. We can find usually 20 to 30% savings in just how you would back it up traditionally in the native environment, to then also get all the benefits after the fact as well. Yeah, if that helps. Biggest competitors in space right now, we have to break down between.
It's a different competitors for different areas of the business. Yeah, like for the backup, we have different competitors. I mean,
I feel like it's like the Baronis of the world, the Clown Vaults, the Veritas, the Beams from backup and recovery. From a DSPM standpoint, which is kind of the pre and during, that's right now Sierra, Big ID Security, Baronis. Someone like Wiz, like a good example is a company like Wiz, who grew out of a CSPM use case, has a DSPM module. To be quite frank, we have customers that have Wiz that use our DSPM feature set, right? So it all comes down to just feature functionality.
I think everyone's trying to like fill the gap with ESPN. Like every platform right now is trying to kind of add that as a feature.
Yeah, it just comes down to like that core use case. What are you trying to use it for? And then how does that tie into your backup strategy and the recovery strategy?
I think that's our differentiators. Like we don't have to, like we do it all with one single platform.
Both versus. So we do have integrations. To Lawson's point, we like the idea that we can do this all in-house, where other, you may have a strong DSPM vendor mixed with a strong backup vendor, but there's two vendors in the mix. We just like the nice and clean. So that's one thing. The other side of that is, we do have integrations with, we have like a policy and violation engine where we can highlight, hey, these assets are public, we should take care of it. Those can get ported out to like Jira, to ServiceNow, like your ticketing systems. We can send it out to Datadog and then tools. Speaking of where we can enhance their data with our classifications to make their enriched the data they have, which at the moment is stronger than their in-house solution, but we're partnered with them, right? So, at a core end-to-end, we can do it all. At the same time, if you already have existing tools, again, on like ticketing, SOC tooling, we can integrate with those. That was really what you're looking for, right? Yeah, sure, absolutely.
So, quick question, so we have 6,000 customers, right? So if you have a data extraction happening to one customer, you will learn from that and introduce those learning to your modules so that it can be detected in other customers. Is that happening or how is it?
It's a great, I mean, I know we have like threat teams that are looking at kind of aggregate across our customer base. I don't have the details on what.
I would say in general, yes, and I'd say the past few years, we used public threat feeds as well as data that we found internally.
No, public, I'm clear. Everybody gets feeds on that.
Yeah.
So
So
talking about you have a specific unique situation where you're living and breathing 6,000 customers.
Yeah.
Like in your contracts or things, is it okay for you to kind of look at that scenario and rebuild your product to kind of tackle those type of things? That's fine. It's a takeaway question.
That's a great takeaway for sure.
I want to say we can cover that. I will say like something that was just announced maybe 2 weeks ago is an ambient integration, which is a lot of the largest companies are using that for like threat prevention, indicators of compromise. That's directly part of our solution as of today. That was announced a few weeks ago. Again, before that, we're using public, some private. At some point it was maybe behind the scenes before that was public. Now, in terms of, we have a central, we call it Sentry AI, which is a more or less a back-end look at all customers in aggregate, and that's where we're deriving some things like that.
Yeah, that's what I'm looking. You have an AI module.
Yeah,
That's looking at all these things. I think driving value for all customers.
for sure. I
Yeah,
just
and
don't
that's-
have specifics.
Okay.
I'm
All right.
happy to provide some anecdotes and for what we're
But
doing.
yeah, that absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you.
Any other questions? I know we're over time. Hey, really appreciate everyone's time today. Thank you for the great questions. Allowing us to present. Yeah, I thought it was a great audience and I'm glad we were able to kind of share why Rubrik's in this, cybersecurity realm, how we're kind of expanding our capabilities around cybersecurity, specifically in the cloud. So if there's any follow-up questions, my email's up here. Feel free to shoot me an email. We did not have a chance to show a demo today. So if anyone's interested in seeing a quick 30-minute demo, or we actually have some click-through demos that are 10 minutes if you just want to kind of get something quick and dirty, happy to send it over as well.
I could probably show it in like 10 minutes. Are we kind of a hard stop?
No, we don't have hard stop. We have time. Go ahead and do it. If
Yeah.
Is that okay with folks? to
Yeah.
See it for a few minutes? I'll
Yeah.
I'll move through it quickly.
Yeah, we'll sure close at the hour.
Yeah, maybe take like a 5-minute break. I'll set up and then come back.
There's a lot of food out there. Please help yourself. We don't want to waste food.
Yeah, I hope you don't mind. I mean, if it's helpful to see it.
Yeah, absolutely. It is helpful. I was about to say that and then you said it. So
People usually show demo?
some went depending on who it is. Yeah, they did some of them did.
You're just sharing it right off of the Zoom.
So you probably the swag that you brought, you probably want to mention it. Otherwise, people wouldn't know.
Hey, Mark. Hey, Mark. You see?
So you brought caps or something?
Yeah, we did.
Okay.
That are things to think about when we're looking at data risk in general. ultimately where we support today is our three major cloud providers, Snowflake, G Drive, as well as Microsoft 365. And we also support on-prem. So anywhere that our appliances are backing up on-prem, Windows, Linux, VMs, information, we can look at that as well. So it really is becoming a full spectrum look at the data that you have accessible. Any questions there? This is the only slide I wanted to show just for architecture's sake. Anything? Pretty straightforward. Sorry.
From what I see, it seems like a more intuitive aspect or perspective of lifting shit, right? But making that transition, but more securely.
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, at this stage, from a lift and shift perspective, that's more of a discussion of when you're looking at the application side, it's do you move that to the cloud as is? Do you refactor it, et cetera? The way we're looking at it's going to be once that's nice and stable, and then we're scanning that and then classifying it. So we're looking at your environment as is, and we assume that the application side is kind of taken care of and stable. Does that help, or is that like we're less worried about maybe the application stack? We're strictly looking at data that may be driving the back end of that application stack. So like your back end databases, file stores, things like that. However you set up your app is really up to you as the administrator and engineer. So we're just scanning what we deem as the critical asset, which is that data itself.
What type of access do you need?
Yeah, so we have a white paper out for that for all the details. Effectively what's going on now, I'll actually go back a slide. It's a little bit easier to see. This is even higher level look. Ultimately, when we onboard the account, we create a few different roles. Now the two roles for our actual control, like management plane UI is a SaaS hosted thing that we host. Obviously, that's external to your environment. So what we're doing is we create basically two roles. One role is living in, even stepping back, if you have an AWS account, what we do is we install what we call an outpost, which is some assets in a secure part of your environment that is within your walls. And then we assign a role to that, which is just like read-only access to certain things. That role is segmented from our SaaS tenant. The only thing that gets passed between those is like the classification results, right? We're not touching the raw data. We don't extract the raw data. And so we have that separation of duties where our rubric role can never assume the role that touches your data, if that helps. So yeah, that's a very core tenet. We don't want to, we're very security conscious in that sake. Any questions on that? It's more of how first day or two, again, this tool is great because it onboards extremely quick, 20 minutes, and then scanning occurs. And as Lawson mentioned before, 1 billion files in a day, and it moves quick. I mean, when we work with customers, we would start on a Monday and we have a full report on a Friday of your sensitive data, some recommendations, and then we discuss what that plan looks like moving forward. So that's all I'm going to share from a slide perspective. I like showing that just so you understand kind of how we actually are working with your environment. So now I'm going to bring up the actual dashboard here. So this is our dashboard for our prevention side of the house. This is where you'd land, and if you as a customer were working with us, you'd have your own dedicated tenant that only you can access. And so you start on a dashboard. I know it's a little tricky to see with the screens, but ultimately the information we're trying to show is how many total data assets do you have? What's your total volume that we scanned? More importantly, how many sensitive data records have we highlighted? We do have kind of a policy violation engine, so we're trying to call out the most egregious things in terms of publicly accessible or not encrypted, or could be a number of things. Also highlighting those. But the most important part that we're doing here is the actual data classification. So we take all these, as Lawson mentioned, we have about 170 out of the box. We group them into these 6 major categories, kind of personal, financial, digital. Some solutions out there, that's where they stop. They just say, hey, you have PHI data, you have PII data, you have financial data. There's not really any context there. Where we take it a bit further is, within, I gotta make sure I'm scrolling the right way. When we go, we have, say, social security numbers, we have email addresses, we have driver's licenses, we have gender information, last name, first name. That's from a personal standpoint. My favorite in terms of a technical side is we're looking at potential passwords, AWS tokens, secure information in GitHub, whatever it may be there. And what we can do from here is say we want to look at, where our social security number information is highlighted. We can just click on it. And that brings us to our asset inventory, which is really how you filter out results and start looking into things. And this, we're breaking it down between S3 bucket, blob storage, EBS volumes, et cetera. And so on a per asset basis, you can see what data types we found within that. We try to give it another layer of context and say we found backups here. Maybe this is HR data to give a little more information. Ultimately, we rank all these assets in 2 ways. We say, what sensitivity is it, which means it's got the most important data that we classified. This should be highly protected, as well as a risk score. And that comes from our policy engine, where we're saying if this asset specifically is known to be exposed to the internet, is not using a best practice around, data encryption and transit and at rest, these are the things we want to focus on, because not only is it important, but it's a risk to the business. Yep.
So you identify whether it's encrypted or not, you pull back in your metadata about what type of encryption algorithm is being used or anything like that?
We can, yes, and that becomes a question around how we do discovery. So say you have an encrypted database or something. What we would do is mimic your key management system within AWS if it's hosted, for example, and be able to read that data, but not with the master key. It's like a sub key. And then we destroy all that once we're done classifying it. Now, if you bring in your own key or you have your own KMS or something, there is a slightly separate process where we have to be provisioned like an intermediary key to be able to read that. So we work really nicely with managed cloud key services. But if you do bring your own or something, we have a process there as well. In terms of actual information around the encryption itself, that's a good question. I don't believe we do that specifically, but if there's a use case there, what we can do is, speaking of these data types, we can create custom ones. And if that's something that's marked in a way that we can see it in the file or understand it in the encryption schema, we can always pull that information out. So that might be a follow-up question that we can cover. Speaking back to, so we have this S3 bucket. We found social security numbers among many other things. We have credit scores, credit card numbers, potentially, proprietary information is something that we loaded as an example, but LLM model information, contracts. Well, we want to look deeper into where those social security numbers are. So we can go in here and, again, dive into that specifically. Now, the cool thing that we can do is not only scan the file itself, but understand the file structure within that. We can actually go down to the file level and say, okay, we have a backup SQL file that we found all these social security numbers on. That's obviously an issue. We can click into that SQL file, not only understand the information about it, see that it's publicly exposed, see what other kind of data types are within it. But the cool thing here is we can even dive into the schema of the SQL itself and dive in and say, hopefully this thing get hidden by the room screen. But we can break down the actual fields. So you can look into an Excel sheet, a CSV, structured, semi-structured, et cetera, and really dive into what's in there. And then what I think is probably the coolest part is there's a social security field here. Obviously, we can live sample that data and take a look and make sure that's real data. Maybe it's a false positive. And so this is like a 10-minute quick hit a random sampling of that data store to confirm, oh yeah, there's actually socials here, like we need to take care of it. So we can take that sensitive discovery, let you see it in real time. Again, nothing is stored persistently. This is like a quick sample. This blows away and there's a timer up top. It's active for 10 minutes. That's a real use case of like diving into where your sensitive data is, for example. Any questions on that?
Are you doing, like path analysis, where the data is,
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, and this might not be the greatest example because I think there's only one file in here, but I could show you one where it's like a full breakdown, multi-folder. Actually, let me see if I can find one of that like that real quick.
So we can do it later.
Okay. Yeah, let me save that one. I'll come back to it if you don't mind. Okay. So that's one use case is initially finding your, not only identifying your data, scanning your data. Now this asset inventory, we can really filter it any way you want. We have our main sources, your Azure disk, your blob storage, your MySQL databases, et cetera. You can filter by file type. You can filter by the classifications in this tool we call data types. So this is where you can break down and say, I want to search again specifically for social security numbers and filter on that. We can also look at your specific onboarded accounts. Like in this case, we have an AWS account, an Azure account, M365, et cetera. So a good way to break it down and really start searching it, what's your most risky, what's your most sensitive data. Yep. And, just with a simple kind of column sort, or you can even highlight here, I only want to look at critical risk assets. That can filter it down. And, as we go down, we see that these are, and when we say restricted, that means it contains one of our data types that we deem as most critical, most sensitive. And as we go down, we see, it's still critical, but maybe it doesn't have as much sensitive data in this specific, in this case, it's like a OneDrive file store, for example. So yeah, there's a lot of different ways you can manipulate the data there.
Can you add like your own custom, what we would think would be important?
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, so I can show you that real quick. So in our settings page, you can go to data types, and right now, say we have 178 out of the box. This kind of provides 2, maybe even 3 benefits on this page. You can see exactly what data types come out of the box that may fill your need. You can see how it's rated out of the box from us, which again is changeable. You can change it based on your own environment or your perceived impact. You can see how many data records specifically hit those data types. If you just want to see like what's my most egregious, high rated data type that's out there. If it's really noisy or something you may not need, you can actually deactivate the actual data type. But what you're asking for is how do you actually add one? So we have 2 methods here. One is from the user perspective. It's limited to regex. If you have a very specific pattern of regular expression for something you're looking for.
You want to share like what the example is?
Sure.
I was just thinking of something like we have for like how to internally classify employees, but it'd be more like internal information, but not still something I want outside,
Yeah, definitely.
That's a good point. Yes, we had like a hotel chain, and they have a customer number that is, I guess, can be identifiable to that person, and maybe that's something I had in order to make sure that I was flagged. But also maybe more question like the pharmaceutical company that looks like molecules and be able to tag that and classify that. So yeah, it's very flexible. It is something that we work with, like a data science team, that we can work on more complex examples, and they create a model based on the information you guys provide.
It's the process of like, they just go with your defaults and what you guys say is important, and then they're saying it's getting this classified, or like, would they just work with you to fix it, or?
Yeah, so it could be 2 ways. We could go back here and we try to be very good about having a highly confident result. Now you can, within the tool, you can obviously report it as false positive, and that goes directly to our backend teams, and there's probably a conversation to be had. You can always change, you can't change the actual policy of these built in, because it's more than just the regex statement, it's kind of the contextual piece. But there's always ways we can work with anybody there. To go back to this, because I think that helps with the question as well, is first, the one way is you can create your own regex, and like Lawson said, that's a very specific pattern that may be repeatable in your environment. This one on the right, though, is, I want Rubric to assist me with creating the rule. That's where you can add a note of exactly what you're trying to build. Typically, you would send us like a representative sample of what you're trying to find, whether that's a real or a made-up file. And then our team's actually building it with contextual awareness, and then we'll put it back into your specific tenant. So now you have like a custom policy that fits your environment specifically. So there is a method there, and the turnaround time's a few days, give or take. So. Yep.
You mentioned about the false positive.
Mhm.
So how it fits it? Says, let's say the data is, the data belongs to the client,
Mhm.
and you have the product installed. Let's say the sandbox or whatever you want. So if they find, okay, X amount of data is false positive, how they communicate with you that without telling what the data is about and how you fix it?
Yeah, so I mean, I'll say personally, I haven't seen that occur. Now, if it did occur, what would typically happen is either you as the client would come to us and say, hey, this is mischaracterizing certain data. We have a pretty quick turnaround on fixing that on a back end perspective, and we can say, oh, maybe there is an issue here. So it's mostly a communication thing. Now you can flag it, as I mentioned, within the tool itself, and just say, like when you live sample data and it doesn't show up like what it's classified as, you can just click, this isn't right, and that kicks directly to our back-end development for the most part. But outside of that, there's a lot we can do in the back end to tailor even out-of-box policies that may need to be tweaks for your environment. I'll just say anecdotally, I haven't seen that occur yet.
Sorry, my question is more about like, does the LLM learn on its own based on like if I do feedback? Or is it something that manually being checked by process of
Sure.
and then figure it out, okay, what needs to be created or changed in terms of policy or rules?
It's a bit of both. So we do have.
You click it and say like this false training model will not show that.
Yeah, there is an automatic side to that, as well as some manual intervention just to be aware of the potential situation. But yeah, these are constantly retraining themselves and making sure that we're at, I think, the threshold, because we've had policies that they didn't instantiate in the tool because they're only like 80% confidence when we want to be at 97% confidence, 98% confidence. So they're making sure that as best as we understand, it's extremely accurate out of the box.
I think what you're talking is more like custom stuff, because again, out of the box, we have over 95% accuracy rate. And again, that's stuff that we do through a POC and actually validate and show you this. So, good question.
Yep, sure. And I'll jump ahead just for I know it's getting late here. So we talked about the asset inventory, being able to look at the data itself and look at some of the data types. A really key use case that we show here is we're hooking into things like AWS Identity Center and looking at the raw permissions. And I think the best part of this here is you can't necessarily have permissions without sensitive data understanding and vice versa. So what we're able to do is highlight X user or X role or X group has access to these specific sensitive data sets out there, and it could be a concern. So I'll highlight, one user specifically. That's a good example. So, maybe we have this user, Tony Stark here, and if we click into this person, we can see, okay, he's a data quality manager as designed. He's in 2 groups. He's got a role assigned. But most importantly, if worst case scenario, if this user's credentials were stolen, this is the blast radius of what can be accessed. The amount of sensitive data, the amount of restricted things, what type of data type specifically, which is really important to understand least privilege permissions and how we want to rain down on user access. We also give a quick highlight on, and hopefully you can see that with the screens, but we can see that this user has write access to 2 different account environments. And within those environments, you can also, I know it's going to be blocked a little bit, but you can see also what sensitive information he can access within that environment specifically, and drill into it. So really useful from an identity perspective. And then we can also more of a global look at which group is he assigned with, and then do the exact same search. So we can look at the analysis group has rewrite to a ton of information. Maybe that's not exactly what we want. Same with roles as well. And that's ultimately how we tie in who can access what, and we have a focus on what's the most important. Any questions there?
Could you query one access of the last 48 hours? Like if I'm like, okay, I know this guy, Cody got compromised, I want to see everything he access to the text downloads.
So at the moment, we wouldn't do, let me think on that. I'll jump to this and I'll answer that at the same time. So a lot of the stuff I was just showing you was more of what we would call like our pre-attack when we think about like pre, during, and after. This would be more of our during phase, which is our data detect and response focus, and hopefully y'all can see. But ultimately, this is where we're going to be looking at things that may be happening in real time. And, you know, we've got examples. This is where we kind of take a lot of audit information and filter it down into some actionable insight. So the same user that I highlighted, for example, is Tony Stark. Maybe a day ago, he started looking at different files that he usually hasn't been. Then he had a first-time download of a sensitive asset, you know, and we're looking at this from, I'd say, a 12-month perspective. Like he's never touched this stuff. Something may be off. And then as we kind of go further and further on the attack here, then we finally say, okay, he's excessively downloaded files. We need to really check into this. When we go into this specifically, we kind of get an action report of this event. And so we see that there's been 17,000 files downloaded, a certain number of records that were impacted. We have a direct ID of who this user is and can click directly into his identity information. Again, we're repeating this blast radius information of like, this could be the worst case scenario here. We get a timeline of when this occurred within, say, the last day, just kind of out of nowhere. He downloaded 17,000 files, like obviously something strange. He's logging in different IPs, different environments. And ultimately, to kind of come back to your question, sir, this is the actual files that were downloaded. So specific file names, paths, the data types associated with that. And so that's kind of sorted by severity. And then we can look at the other side of that, which is the pure log information, the actual get like object API calls for when they grab that information. To answer your question fully, right now, we don't do that on a user by user basis as just everyday inspection. But if something is anomalous, we're looking at that information and storing it kind of at a longer term. If something looks out of the ordinary, that's where it'd pop up on this specifically. Any questions there? Cool. For the sake of time, I know we're very close here. The 2 things I'll wrap up with is I mentioned that we have kind of a policy and violation engine. We take a look at this data ultimately in 4 different ways. We're looking at overexposed data, you know, has access. Is it publicly accessible? Are third-party contractors that we've identified able to access sensitive information? Things in that realm, as well as unprotected, you know, is it encrypted? Are typical security checks enabled in the cloud environments? Misplaced data is interesting from like say a GDPR or compliance perspective. Is EU-based email addresses and information found in our US servers? That could potentially be a fine or worse. So we want to highlight things like that. And then redundant data is really a focus on one of the biggest avenues of attack is stale data, or backups that aren't associated with anything anymore that are just hanging in the environment that you may not even be aware of. That presents a risk because that data is kind of ignored. It still probably has sensitive stuff within it, and we want to highlight that. And then we represent, I won't show really the policy page, but ultimately we have policies that'll highlight, publicly exposed sensitive data. We can dive into the assets directly as well as what's at risk. User access not allowed. Sensitive files missing a MIP label. I think that's one I'll show real quick. Again, a lot of information here. Let me skip down a bit. So here we're looking at sensitive data that does not have a MIP label associated, which means that we found it as highly sensitive, but it's not, or it doesn't have like a purview Microsoft information protection, aka MIP label associated, and we'd like to do that. So we can actually go in here and look at the violating information, the actual file paths themselves. And let me find a good example for you. So let me try one more. Just a second. So we can actually go in and say this, in this case, like an S3 bucket, we can go in and actually apply the MIP label, which could be confidential, highly confidential, et cetera. And then that goes out and applies it in real time. So that kind of fits into our story from earlier about labeling data accurately, and focusing on making sure that it's represented correctly. Any questions on that one?
Did somebody already apply that MIP label to the other ones that were grayed out?
That's what it'll look like. Yep. So this would be, yep. So that, and there, speaking of that too, since these are kind of tickets, more or less, there is a workflow within the tool that you can like close out things. Most times, folks will send that out to their ticketing systems of choice, like a ServiceNow or something. But you can take some of the workflow inside it as well.
One question, in a large organization, you will have the data and, issues with data like vulnerabilities, right? How do we link it back to the data owner? Just to give an example, let's say we have hundreds of servers, 100,000 servers, right, in the organization. So what happens if there is a, let's say, JVM or Java virtual machine vulnerability is there, right? So there is a tool which finds it. These are the vulnerabilities. And then it knows the server details. And then there is a organizational level inventory, which says this server belongs to this product, and then this is the product one. So the kind of there's a link, and then like in my organization, we used to automatically get tickets created in ServiceNow to say that okay, these are the 100 vulnerabilities against your product. So in the same like situation, like if we have such data available, how do you link it back? Is there like kind of mechanism by tagging or somehow API commonly provided the product?
Yeah, so the best way to answer that right now is we can see and sort by, if we go back to like the asset side, we can see who's created those assets or what account they're under. It kind of comes down to how you structure the cloud account. Sometimes it's one account that does everything, and others you separate it out. So we can see that information and sort through that. The other way would be on the identity page, we have access. Now, I don't think right now we have a direct link between our identity page and the assets that specific user owns. We're looking more at their like IAM permission set and less of their, I guess, asset ownership, if that makes sense. So right now, ultimately, we probably look at that through the asset inventory side itself and figure out either what account it's under or what user has associated with that asset itself, and then be able to filter down a bit.
I think that will be a great link, right? What is the asset and who's the owner for that?
Okay,
Because
sure.
it would be difficult, like, for an organization with like, billions of reports and number of files. And most of them are created automatically by, let's say, system admin or accounts, right?
Mhm,
So there is
sure.
no way to figure it out, like, who actually wrote the data.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean,
Okay.
yeah, and I'd say like even what we see now is, depending on the company, most of it's being built through Terraform, CloudFormation. So it's like an API user where it's hard to track back to a real source. So that's where we have to start looking at like account hierarchy and saying, okay, this is owned by our development group, and here's their GitHub repository, and here's, so the conversation could go deeper, but I get what you're saying.
I thought there's like a thin line between data governance and data security. So like having like the data lineage, I don't know, it's more of like a purview tool, that data governance tool. We're just focused on the security classification. But a lot of people are asking, hey, can you trace back to it? So I totally get it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Again, for the sake of time, I'm wrapping up. The last thing we would show from like a daily perspective is, just for the sake of having something that represents this from a bigger scale, is more or less showing an executive landscape of maybe these accounts have sensitive data and there's a risk associated with it. So like anything else, big score on the left, low score on the bottom. And this becomes something that you can help track down with your groups. You can create your own business units outside of just account data, so you can start organizing it in different ways. We have RBAC installed in the tool, so only certain people can see certain accounts. So you can get pretty flexible with how folks actually access this information. That's ultimately it. Hopefully that's a good showcase of what we're doing here. And again, this is more strictly on the pre and during side of that attack. And then we have our core rubric solution with recovery and whatnot that we would show at a different time, frankly. But this is the focus today. So any final questions or anything? Awesome. We really appreciate it. Thanks so much. Yeah.